Well, it's so lovely to see you for a start. I am absolutely thrilled to meet you finally.
Thanks.
I've wanted to meet you for years. I have said to you already how much I loved this film. I thought it was a wonderful piece of work, and I went into it not knowing much about the era and not knowing much about the music. Obviously, I probably could name 3 Bob Dylan songs. I didn't know who Pete Seeger was. And I felt like I came away from it wanting to know a lot more, certainly about Pete.
And we've done our job.
And you've achieved what you
Yes.
set out to.
Yes.
How much did you know about particularly Pete, but also the era?
If you came up as an aspiring artist in New York, you knew about Pete Seeger, even if you weren't a fan of folk or that particular period. Even in, let's say, the early 90s when I moved to New York, Pete Seeger was like the Gandalf of the artist as activists. You know what I mean? He had this looming presence of he was the folk singer who started the environmental movement to clean up the Hudson River and who had worked on the civil rights movement. And, so you knew of him. In some ways, he was just one of those people who was in the pantheon.
Yeah.
And I knew from being a kid whose mom had Peter, Paul and Mary records and who I would sit and look at, if I had, the Hammer song, if I had a hammer written by Pete Seeger, and Where Have All the Flowers Gone, Pete Seeger. I said, so who is Pete Seeger? So he wrote all these songs, But I didn't really grasp the degree to which he was of a previous generation, and that he had really carried the torch of the folk movement and of kind of the left wing, protest, the idea of music and the protest song and music as an instrument of social change across from the 30s, and kept it alive for this new generation, to inspire this new generation that was Dylan and Joan Baez and stuff like that. I didn't know that he had spent almost a decade blacklisted in the anti-communist sort of witch hunts and all of that. And that was really fascinating.
I remember that from my history A level. I think you studied history as well, right? So I'm sure you looked into that. I mean, it's such a fascinating period of history. There were so many huge societal changes around that point. And I found this film, the kind of insight that you get into living in that time. The Cuban Missile Crisis scenes is fantastic.
It's funny that you mentioned that because that's not the section of the film that you see as much of Pete Seeger, and there's a little bit of it. But when I watched the film, objectively, like as an audience, I had the same reaction, which is realizing that I really wasn't attuned to how anxious, how much anxiety that created. And obviously it makes sense that literally people thought there might be a nuclear war. But as you say, the experience, when a film creates a feeling of immersion, not so much plot, but more just of immersion in what a moment felt like, it's cool. It's really cool. And I had the same reaction, which is a real sense of like, wow, I sort of take for granted what a crisis this felt like.
Yeah. And the fact that we know, and it sounds so obvious, but we know that it was resolved and it was fine.
Exactly.
But they didn't, and they thought, he went out that night thinking that might be the last night on Earth.
Yeah, and I think, even as a fan of his music, I do tend to think of a lot, lazily you go, well, Dylan's message songs or his topical songs had a lot to do with the civil rights movement, and they do. But you forget that Masters of War and some of these other things are very much about the nuclear, the feeling and Hard Rain, and a lot of it has to do with the Cold War and the nuclear anxiety and all of it, which we blessedly have almost kind of moved beyond. But they were a generation that was really under the anxiety of the Cold War and of the idea of nuclear war and all of it.
Yeah, I mean, something else I noticed which really stuck with me, which seems silly, but the fact that there's a scene where he walks into a party, Bob Dylan walks into a party, and and everyone is obviously very excited to see him, but nobody's on their phones, obviously. No one is filming him. Nobody
Right.
is. This moment existed, this wonderful moment that they would be able to describe and tell people about, but everyone was living it in that moment. And God, that made me
That's
really
a really interesting
nostalgic.
observation. No, I agree. It's funny when I worked on a film about Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera that I was one of the writers of too, and I think I remember being really struck reading about the period in the early 30s in Mexico City where all of these people, they had to get together to collide, and you get that feeling in this film too that a lot of the ideation and it came from social interaction,
Yeah.
not from isolated, thumb scrolling and tweet, and it created a fertility. It created an enormous amount of work and great work, like grew up and out of young people being engaged with each other and actually showing up, being in rooms together, bouncing ideas off each other, being in cafes and listening to each other play, but then also going to the marches and being a part of, I don't know, the physical world.
I mean, I am old enough to remember life before smartphones, and I came out and was talking to someone else who'd also seen it and saying that was the bit that had really made me nostalgic for an era that, is not even that long ago. I do feel that so much is lost with the lack of that ability to live in the moment. And I would say also that it's so important to see a film like this on the big screen, and I'm sure you would echo that, because I feel like it's a real experience. It's something you should.
Well, if nothing else too, because I think that the music is it's really immersive, and I think you want to see it with great sound. It's beautiful. The music's beautifully produced and done, and it's great. But I also just think when we talk about immersion, it's easier to get that feeling of entering into a time when you see it big, and it really envelops you. I think that the other thing that's really interesting about Dylan in that time is he was really young, but he had a really powerful instinct to retain sort of the mystery within the work. We're, in addition to the distraction function of all these devices, as you're talking about, the other thing is that I think we've created this thing where we've kind of made a collateral and a value out of being totally available artists, almost like interacting personally with people in every moment of their lives all the time. And I do think people underestimate how much it reduces the mystery in the work and in the power. And I think you can sort of see in the film how even as a very young artist, Dylan had a very, very strong instinct to keep a curtain up around who he was, his process, because he knew that there was a mystical power in retaining mystery, even around meaning. This isn't in our film, but if you look at Scorsese's great documentary about Dylan called No Direction Home, it's kind of staggering actually to see this 22-year-old kid, when people are calling him the voice of his generation and saying, what's the meaning? And he says, I don't know what it means. I just wrote it. Like, what do you think it means? It's almost like he's like a druid, or a monk who's
more a conduit than a...
Yeah, it's like how can you be 22 years old and have the wisdom to say it's more powerful if you decide what it's about for yourself? That's really he remains, I think, in some ways kind of a North Star in terms of being someone who really understood that he needed to follow his own line, but also that letting everyone behind the curtain didn't make it more powerful, you know?
I mean, you've been in the film business now for nearly 30 years. I think you're... Don't want to trigger you there, which is crazy because I've been watching your films for the same amount of time. But are you glad that you started your career in a time before a lot of this technology, where you weren't expected to be constantly on Instagram doing lives
Yes.
and doing
Well,
behind the
that's a
scenes?
choice, and I don't do it any. I just I don't have the time in life. I honestly look at it. I'm like, I don't understand how people have the mental energy to sustain this. But I think something that I think was more potent when I started working in films. The release of films or albums had this feeling of anticipation because it wasn't accessible. You had to wait for it.
Yeah.
And when it came, there was really only one way to go see it. And it had a feeling of an event. You
Yeah.
know, there was an event, an album, U2, Joshua Tree. It drops and you're like, you know, everybody's losing their minds, right? Like you're trying to get to it.
But you're going out to a
Yeah,
store,
it's
you're
not,
buying
you can't like
it.
wake up, flip on Spotify and
Yeah.
you know, and the white noise of everything everywhere all at once is there. And there's something that's something that I think had power that maybe we've lost. But there's always trade-offs. Like the flip side of that is, you know, if there was like a great Swedish film, the odds of most people seeing it were about like 1 in 1,000. You know what I mean? Whereas
Yeah.
today, it's indisputable that one of the great things about these platforms, let's call them, and the availability and the change, the liberation of form, you know, it's not just a 2-hour film anymore now. There's been a lot of liberation in sort of the form of the way we make things and tell stories in song and in story, but also it's indisputable that we're accessing a much more diverse realm of language, of voices. It's a lot easier for a woman in Iran to make a film and it gets out to a global audience and we make that connection and we create that empathy and that sense of thing. There's never been a moment of more accessibility to a more diverse array of stories. And I think that's one of the positives
It's a
think
positive trade-off.
about what changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
you know, and
interesting.
like you look at like I don't know if you've seen The Apprentice, this film. It's a brilliant film. It's like being under discussed, I think. But the guy who made that is he's an Iranian immigrant to Sweden, Ali Abbasi, and his films are brilliant, brilliant. And I think about like his story a lot. Like he emigrates from Iran to Sweden. But like I've seen his films, right? And people I know are very aware of them. 20 years ago, no way.
Yeah.
No way are you getting that unless you go to a film festival and hear about it and make a point to go and find it and see it. And that's cool.
That's amazing. Edward Norton, I could talk to you all day, but I need to let you go. But
Thanks.
thank you so much. And
Absolutely.
I urge everybody to go and see A Complete Unknown and to go and see it in the format it deserves in the cinemas.
Thank you.